We kicked off pretty quick. Okay, what's up, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome to Pondering Christianity's channel. We are doing our Afterlife Apologetics podcast as usual, which honestly I'm kind of thinking about renaming the channel anyway. But for those of you who are new here, welcome. My name is Charlie. I'm joined by my awesome co-host Steve. And we are two Christian apologists very much interested in near-death experiences and deathbed visions, thus the focus of the podcast. And for those of you who have not been here for the previous episodes, we have done a very long series on biblical objections because we believe there's just so many of them that are worth spending time on. And frankly, Steve and I wanted to give them the proper space and time necessary. So we've broken it up into three parts. If you are here for this is the first time to the episode, welcome. Please hit subscribe, get the notification bells, all the like stuff. As you guys know, that's a massive help to us to get in front of other people who may also find this interesting and really make this a great resource for Christian skeptics alike so that people can engage with this material in a very thoughtful fashion. And if you were not here for the last episode, if you check the bottom of this description for this video, I have linked the previous episode so that you guys can go back and watch part 9. Or excuse me, episode 9, part 2, episode 8, part 1. So you guys can head back there to check both of those out. Anything to add to that, Steve?
I don't think so. Let's just jump into it.
Okay, so a quick recap. In the last episode, we did a lot more direct engagement with some of the most popular biblical objections that you may hear when it comes to near-death experiences. A couple of those being, Jesus saying no one has ascended to heaven except the one who has descended from heaven. I know that's a very, very popular one. So we spent a good amount of length of time engaging with that one, as well as a couple of other key passages that we have seen commonly cited to say that these near-death experiences are biblically not valid, which of course we completely disagree with, or rather respectfully disagree with. And we listed out our reasons as to why that's the case. Today is going to be a little bit shorter. We want to kind of wrap this up in a nice bow and be concise about the rest of the objections that we find. Maybe a little bit of review just to kind of, like I said, wrap it up in a nice bow so that you can feel confident as we move further into our latter episodes. You guys can feel confident that the Bible does, in fact, provide an incredibly strong foundation for near-death experiences and deathbed visions, as opposed to any kind of issue whatsoever, I would say.
So along that lines, probably in our next episode, I want to deal with the positive convergence of the Bible with near-death experiences. Sometimes when you just deal with objections, it sounds like, oh, there's all these objections, all these objections. But I found at least 47 different areas of convergence with near-death experiences once they're seen in the large respected studies. And just looking at that and comparing it to traditional interpretation of scriptures, I think there's a wonderful convergence. So what we're doing now, though, is we do want to take these objections seriously because good-hearted Christians are saying, "Hey, what about this verse? What about that verse?" And so we need to give answers.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
one of the questions is, what about so many people in non-Christian cultures? Some that may
Mm.
even not really have a very good chance to hear the gospel at this point. Maybe they're not even around many Christians, and yet people in these other cultures will talk about near death and deathbed experiences, and it seems like they're experiencing many of the same core elements as people here in America. A largely Christian, or at least influenced by Christian culture. So, what's the deal with that? And I'd say, on the one hand, that's a part of the reason that we take near death and deathbed experiences seriously is that it's not just a thing that makes sense in the Christian worldview. I mean, it's not just the elements of the experience are not determined by what people expect will happen or their worldview. And so, because of atheists and Christian believers and Muslims and so many having the same elements, that that kind of takes it out of the realm of naturalism, which would say, oh, well, these elements ought to be caused by people's expectations. So it's good for the apologetic end of it in that it shows that it's probably something that's not naturalistic when we see this convergence. But number two, that causes some problems because some will say, hey, wait a minute, for those having a good experience, and they're way off in the boondocks of India somewhere where they may never hear a clear presentation about Jesus Christ. How is it they're having this good experience with a good God, and they may never hear the gospel? I mean, don't you have to hear the gospel and respond to the gospel to be saved? And so, what's going on here? Um, do you have any right offhand response to that, Charlie, or would you like me just to dig right into it?
No, why don't you just jump right into it? Because I think we have a lot of agreement and overlap there. So,
Okay, well, first of all, I mean, we talked about this in the first episode. We were dealing with objections, that this is not an end of life experience where you say somebody who's eventually not saved should experience something horrible, and that somebody who who is saved should experience something great. Actually, we just this is a halftime event where in the middle of life someone is connecting with the other side, maybe the vestibule of heaven. And when they go there, they see a good God. God is kind to both the wicked, the unbelieving. Look at how Jesus dealt with people who were really great sinners, but he was called a friend of sinners. So it's no surprise to me that people in various cultures would go to the other side in a halftime event and encounter a good God, just like people encountered a good Jesus in the New Testament. But what about those who may never hear the gospel? Is this kind of a tease for them, making them think that they're going to be okay? I would say I believe that this experience is meant to encourage people in their seeking, to let them know the general things that number one, there's a God over there. Number two, there's a God who loves them very much. Number three, there's an afterlife. And so it makes sense to seek spiritual values. And according to Jesus, if that person, wherever they are in Irian Jaya and a remote part of India or somewhere, if they seek, Jesus says they'll find. So, one answer would be that somebody's going to come and tell them the gospel if they're truly seeking, or at least enough of the gospel to allow them to be saved. Now, what do I mean by that? Evangelical Christians, that which let's just define as people who kind of believe in a historic, um, not literal interpretation of the Bible, but believe what the Bible teaches about salvation. Um, we all believe that some people will be saved who didn't fully understand the whole gospel.
hmm.
Two groups I'll mention. Number one, Old Testament saints. The Apostle Paul in Romans says these were saved, even though they didn't know Jesus, even though Jesus had not even died for their sins yet, they were saved through faith. Also, we talk about this with people who are before the age of accountability. Let's say you have a little child who was never even old enough to understand the gospel. We'd say, well, we believe that God's going to make that a special case because God is a just God. And so he's not going to penalize them for not being able to understand at that point. I would say a lot of theologians, a lot of good conservative theologians would say maybe that's the case as well for some people overseas who've never heard, who never had a chance to hear, or for someone who's always had an exposure only to a false gospel, even in the Western world, and were turned off to it. Maybe if they come to a point where they know there's a God by general revelation, they know that they've got to trust God for their salvation, and maybe, number one, a lot of these, God will complete that knowledge when they're comatose at the end of life. We see over 80% of the dying actually having these experiences. Maybe God completes that understanding then, or maybe, just like the Old Testament saints, if they're trusting God for their salvation, maybe they don't understand all the little details about Jesus and what he did,
Hmm.
but that God would apply the work of Jesus to their lives because of their actively trusting him.
Yeah,
Um,
I really like. I think Billy Graham was the quote that he discusses essentially that those people have a feeling that there's something more that they're missing. They might have the light and the general revelation, but they understand that there's still a gap between them and this divine figure that is clearly evident to them. And I really like that explanation because to me, it's like that's where the gospel comes and fits right in, and it goes, oh, okay, that's more or less the bridge or the cross, right, between you and God, and it completes that gap of like this makes sense how I'm going to be unified to God in eternity through this story. Um, However, if you don't have that, you just kind of always have this like, I know I need more, so I'm just going to continue to kind of place my faith, my trust in God that He will be faithful, not necessarily, it's not necessarily dependent on me. I'll do the best I can, of course, but my faith is placed in God. And that's kind of how Paul describes Abraham in Romans, that his faith in God is what made him righteous, his trust. So I think that
So I have to believe that when Jesus said, "Seek and you shall find; knock and the door shall be open to you,"
you're right.
that
Yeah.
anybody who's had an experience like this, it has caused them to seek or to seek more fervently. If you seek fervently, you will find eventually, and I just have to believe that God's going to find some way to allow them to accept and understand the gospel enough to be able to make it to heaven.
Yeah. I think it's just safe to say, Steve, that when you look at the gospel and you look at the entire narrative of kind of God's interaction with humanity, it seems to me God is doing everything He possibly can to get everyone He possibly can. And if that means coming to them in a vision right at their death point, if that means coming to them a vision midway through life or at this, at any key interval in life, it doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of eternity as long as God gets them. And I think that no one will escape His grasp. So it's safe to say that I like to say this, that I don't think everybody who's in heaven will have been there because they were a Christian or because of their Christian faith per se, but I do believe that they will be there as a result of their faith, period.
Maybe that's the way to put it. I mean, certainly a lot of theologians go that direction, the directions that we're talking about, to say that he does have a heart for these, that, and he's a fair God. He's going to be fair whatever happens, and we can trust in that. But if they seek, they'll find, and I think we have to trust in that. Now, other
Which
people say, go ahead. Do you want
I
to
was gonna say,
continue?
Steve, quick note. This is total digression, right? This is a rabbit trail. But for a future episode, I absolutely want to talk about how near-death experiences reaffirm the moral arguments for God, that He is a good God, and I think it actually helps answer the question of evil as opposed to oppose it. But yeah, I just want to put that a note out there because that's kind of in that same vein of, because a lot of people will use that objection of like, well, what about all the people who haven't heard? I can't believe in a good God who would just let people go to hell just because they didn't know about Jesus, right? And I think that that's a really valid moral objection to a God who's considered to be perfectly good. So I definitely want to answer that down the road in a lot more detail. But go ahead to the next point, Steve.
Yeah, there's a lot to deal with. There's just a lot of convergence with Christianity that needs to be thought through these experiences. And I just encourage the theologians that are listening, the just regular Christians that are thinking through your faith. Help us think through these things because there hasn't been enough of that so far with these experiences. Some Christians teach very strongly that the soul really can't separate from the body, so they're going to hold that when we die during this church age,
Yeah, you sleep.
that we go into a soul sleep.
Hmm.
Our bodies will be resurrected at the end of time. So they say, well, this really doesn't jibe with the near death experiences because these people are they're awake. They're more aware than ever when they come back from being clinically dead. And so it seems like their soul did separate from their bodies because they're looking back, talking about their
Yeah, out of body.
resuscitation
Yeah,
experience,
out of body
all kinds of
experience.
other things.
Yeah.
They certainly seem to be outside their bodies, and yet these people are saying theologically that doesn't add up because they believe the soul cannot separate from the body, and will always be a body and a soul all together. I don't want to really go into that whole theology. I'd just say look at some of the stronger, historically strong um, systematic theologies that try to bring together a lot of scripture on these topics. What I see is that the people that are arguing for this lack of separation of body of soul, they'll quote a few verses that seem to be showing that, and give a few explanations, counter explanations for other verses that seem to be going against what they're saying, but they don't really deal with the full wealth of scripture on this topic. And I'll just mention when Jesus said to the thief on the cross, "Today you'll be with me in paradise." Well, he was certainly not going to be with Jesus bodily because his body was going to be in the grave, right? How was he going to be with him today? Now, Jehovah's Witnesses or some other people will actually put a comma and say, "I say to you today, you'll be with me in paradise." If you look at like New Testament and 26 translations, nobody seems to be putting a comma there, except for a denomination that has a specific theology that they seem to need to prove and overcome that verse. The very obvious meaning of that verse and what Jesus is saying in his context is to reassure him, "Today you'll be with me in paradise." It's a very straightforward reading. How could that be true if the soul were not able to separate from the body? Matthew 10:28. Don't fear those who are just able to kill the body but can't kill the soul. Okay, well, there he seems to put the soul in a different category than the body. Um,
Hmm.
we see the little girl in Luke 8:55. A young girl died. Jesus brought her back to life, and it says her spirit returned. Apparently, her spirit was somewhere else, then it returned to the body. So I would just challenge people who are saying that the soul and the body cannot separate. Look at the full range of verses on that and actually talk about that in my new manuscript, which ought to be published in about a month. And you can kind of look over those verses if you're concerned about that issue. Um,
I was gonna,
Some people say maybe we ought to jump into this about people who believe that miracles would cease after the New Testament.
dispensationalism.
Yeah, so, and I don't know what your experience is with that. Places like Dallas Theological Seminary used to be uh, very strong on that. I think that they probably have have opened up to other interpretations through the years from what some people have told me. That was associated with Dallas. And a lot of people, in fact, one of the early churches I went to was big on dispensationalism when I was growing up. I attended a Bible church. But what they would say is that God worked differently in different dispensations in the Bible. So you had the time, for example, when Moses was doing all of these miracles and separating out the children of Israel from Egypt. And so he worked a lot of miracles. And that's what brought in the law, right? The Ten Commandments. Then you have another time where God is instituting the prophets, and you have Elijah and Elisha, and all these miracles pop up. And then, but you don't hear as many miracles in between those type things. Then the type of time of Jesus, obviously, we need a lot of miracles to show that he was the Son of God. The establishing of the church, you've got Pentecost and all these miracles to establish that. But they would say, okay, but after we have the canon of Scripture, after we know the books of the Scripture, got that, why do we need all those miracles? We don't need prophets anymore who are giving the scripture. Some people who are dispensationalists would say that, that these miracles ceased or are no longer needed. And so, therefore, something like a near death or deathbed experience, which seems to be miraculous when you look at it, seems kind of like
A
a sign
vision.
and a
Yeah.
wonder or a vision. Uh, so those really can't happen. They must be of the devil. And I think some of the people that attack near death experiences, that they're coming sometimes from that overall theological paradigm, which makes something like this very unlikely as something that God would do. So I would just say number one, and you can read lots of books on this and go into great depth. But number one, I just don't see any clear teaching, direct teaching in scripture saying that God would not continue to do miracles. In fact, a lot of scriptures just seem to say that whoever believes will be able to do great works. Now, miraculous works. Um, I do believe it may be that we no longer have a gift of miracles, and a lot of cessationists, people who believe that miracles have ceased, some cessationists really believe there is no gift of miracles, like somebody who can just put them out there almost like Jesus did. And I too have my hesitations about people who claim to be healers. I'm just not so sure about how much they're able to, certainly don't seem to be doing it like Jesus did. And so I have my questions about that. But a lot of people who are cessationists would say that no, we believe that miracles still happen. There's just no gift of miracles. So when I look at verses like at the end of 1 Corinthians 13, where he's saying that knowledge will cease, all these things will cease. Sometimes they say, oh, well, that's talking about at the end of the of once the canon is established, we'll no longer need these special gifts of knowledge and prophecy and miracles, so they will cease. Number one, it seems to me pretty evident that the end of 1 Corinthians 13 is really talking about the end of time when things will be different. We'll see all things clearly as he sees them now. Secondly, it looks like the end of Revelation where it says, don't add to this book. I think he's talking about Revelation, but I agree with them. We're not talking about adding to Scripture. The experiences that I see that we're talking about that are evidenced in the studies of, um, physicians and others who are reputable, I just don't see them spouting out new theology or claiming that we're adding to the Bible. They're just giving individuals direction and general theology, kind of like we know from natural revelation. Okay, there is a God, there is an afterlife, but I don't see them giving new theology. So I would just challenge those who believe that God no longer works miracles. I just don't see that clearly taught in the scripture. And I see a lot from scripture that teaches we should expect there to still be miracles during our time.
Well, and the fact that there are miracles during our time is backed up by several studies. For example, Lee Strobel cites a good amount of them in his book Case for Miracles, where he goes through and evaluates, for example, prayer, intercessory prayer for miraculous healing, or investigating a wide spread visions of Jesus in Middle Eastern countries, for example, with heavy Islamic influences. So there's two cases right there that have been studied in modern day that show things are still occurring. And ultimately, Steve, I think it runs into the fallacy of evidence of absence doesn't necessarily mean absence of evidence, in the sense that you're basically saying, well, since it's not documented, there it wasn't happening, which we very well know that the Bible doesn't approach things that way. The Bible is very much like reporting the minimal facts that it can, I think, to kind of clearly communicate the point it's trying to get across. But even in, I can't remember the gospel off the top of my head, and you help me out with that, Steve. Even at the end of it, it says that we've only listed some of what Jesus did. We didn't even list all of what he did. And so therefore it seems practical to me that even though they may not have listed all of these actions as they occurred, there is still plenty of miracles happening in between these time frames, all the way up through history. I think you can find that even in church tradition, that there are reported miracles in the accounts between the church fathers communicating with one another, and so on and so forth. To just think that God used them in a certain time frame, I can understand the point of using them in a certain time frame to affirm the writers as a means of saying, hey, these are my people that I have as my representatives, and using them to kind of sign off on them. But I don't think that the position that they just suddenly stop after that is any way, shape, or form accurate, because I don't think the data reflects that, nor do I think there's any biblical evidence to create a strong enough position for that, apart from maybe saying that in these periods he reveals himself in a select fashion, and then after that he doesn't anymore. Or maybe arguing that, God has, during the prophet and exile periods of Israel, that maybe he disappeared in that time frame, or that he just wasn't presently active in that time frame, and then when a prophet comes on the scene, that's how he's kind of making himself known. But again, that requires knowledge to know that God isn't actively doing miracles or acting miraculously in the lives of the people at the time frame. He could be very well doing miraculous healings doing visions, visiting people in that type of capacity. So I just think that the level of evidence necessary to make that point is just so high that there's just no point even to approach it that way.
Now, I think there are benefits to dispensationalism, which I see. I think that God did work in different times in the Old Testament than the New Testament. There is a different relationship with the law now,
Sure.
now that we're under grace. So that I'm not saying just throw out all of dispensationalism. And I do think that God worked particularly through Jesus. If we had people working the same miracles that Jesus worked all over the place today, then Jesus wouldn't be anything special.
Yeah.
Like when you see people throwing out demons today, it may be a long process over the months of prayer and meeting and whatever, and Jesus just cast them out with a word. Well, that's our evidence that Jesus was something special. Jesus was God in the flesh. But to say that since Jesus is no longer here on earth, needing to prove himself, therefore we don't need any miracles anymore, I think that's going beyond the scripture. You were looking for John chapter 21, into the Gospel of John. He says, "This is the disciple who bears witness of these things and wrote these things. We know this witness is true. And there are also many other things which Jesus did, which, if they were written in detail, I suppose that even the world itself could not contain the books which were written."
Yeah.
Pretty impressive thing. So I think God's all about miracles. And in fact, that scripture where he said, unless unless you people see signs and wonders, you simply will not believe.
Mm-hmm.
That may be a statement not just for a few characters there in the first century, but for the way a lot of people are today. They need something special to allow them to believe.
Yep.
So I think that covers that. I don't know that we need to say anything. I feel like Forrest Gump, and that's about all I want to say about that. What about you?
I think that that's
Um,
sufficient. Yeah.
so in general, I would like to wrap this section up by saying, uh, when typically the objections that I'm seeing are not from people who don't understand their Bibles or something like this. Generally, we're dealing with two different sets of data. When people like John MacArthur and others write in their books against near death experiences, they read books in this heaven tourism genre of books where people just write about their stories of what happened to them. Some of them are touting New Age doctrine. Some of them, well, at least one of them, proved to be fictitious. They claimed it was real, but later admitted it was not. So you have all kinds of experiences out there. People like him and Hank Hanegraaff read these books out there and said, "Wow, this is dangerous stuff. We need to believe the Bible. We don't need to believe these." And I agree with them. We need to be warned against believing everything that we hear and just soaking up every experience someone tells us. The fool believes everything he hears. So I'm with those guys. It's just that when I studied near death and deathbed experiences, and you as well, we began to study the studies of near death and deathbed
Yeah.
experiences so that you got beyond a lot of the people who may have mental illness, maybe just touting a certain doctrine that they're trying to, you know, popularize. And so, number one, make sure we're dealing with the same data when people are criticizing the experiences. And number two, make sure when you're dealing with scriptures that you don't just quote out proof texts without the context and understanding. We need to take a stronger view on scripture to truly understand what those scriptures are saying and what they're not saying before we make some kind of declaration on them.
Mm.
And it's not only dangerous. Some people say, well, it's better if you're going to err on the side of the conservative. Let's just not look at these experiences if it's possible that some of them are of the devil. I don't think it's safe to err on the side of the conservative. I think biblically it's never safe to err. And sometimes if we happen to be calling what God's doing, calling that of the devil, that's a pretty serious thing. So we don't want to go off on either of these extremes. I think we want to look at each experience, look at it biblically. Is this changing somehow theology from what God's already said? If so, we better not accept that as Christians. Is this a sane person? Is this a person who has a secondary motive for writing their experience, like they're making money off of it or getting fame or getting news interviews. All those things should be going through our heads. We need to be thinking as Christians and thinking theologically and thinking biblically. And that's what we're trying to do here. And we welcome people's comments below as you have concerns or think there are scriptures that we've not dealt with or that we've dealt with inaccurately, because we're all in this trying to understand these things together.
So ultimately, discernment is what we're saying. Use discernment. I think that sufficiently summarizes how we approach these.
Sounds good. I'm with you on that.
All right. So like I mentioned earlier, ladies and gentlemen, this one will be a little bit shorter. So I know we're getting close to the end here. Steve, do you think that there's any other major topics that we need to broach as it pertains to biblical objections to near-death experiences or deathbed visions?
Well, I dealt in a couple of chapters with that in my book. If you want to go further on these, and I give the documentation, the commentaries I consulted, the Art and Gingrich's lexicon when I needed to go in to look at a lexicon of Greek terms. So I go much more in depth there if you want to go that if you need to go further.
And the
But
name of the book
I think we've
is
covered it.
Plug the Book. Plug the Book.
Well, it's not out yet, so just be watching for it, and I hope the title will stay the same as we go along. But
Oh,
it ought
okay.
to be out within a month. Just look up J. Steve Miller, Deathbed Experiences, and you ought to be able to find my books there.
As well as his near-death experiences as evidence for heaven and the afterlife, I believe is the subtitle of
Yes.
that one.
Hmm.
So that's his first book, and then his second book is Deathbed Visions, where he kind of continues this thought process, but applying it more so to deathbed visions. And then he's writing one now, which working title I think is Christianity compatible, or are near-death experiences compatible with the Christian worldview? I think is the yeah. You like that title name or no?
I don't know. I can't remember what I write, Charlie. I'm in the process of doing it all, and I'll figure it all out later.
Yeah.
But it's basically on the topic of, are near death and deathbed experiences compatible with Christianity? We'll just put it that way
Yeah.
for now.
And for those of you curious, once the channel is big enough for us to list products, we will list Dr. Miller's books as well as my book once it's out. So, and hopefully in the near future we can have really quick and easy links for you guys to just simply click and go get your hands on that material. Which, if you want to go further, that is absolutely the best direction to go. And then from there, if you really want to engage with the material further, you can of course engage with the studies and the research that we both cite in our books to see the actual data itself. All right, cool. Well,
Well, let me mention, whenever we're promoting our stuff here, I want to make sure you understand I don't make much money off of these books. And if I'm concerned to get the truth out there and to get us thinking about these things, and if you just want a free PDF, um, jstevemiller@gmail.com. Email me. I'll send you a free PDF of any of my books. I have the rights to them specifically for that reason, because I want to get the information out there. We're not out to make a bunch of money.
well, I mean, speak for yourself, Steve. I'm definitely in this to make a bunch. No, I'm just kidding.
Are you milking me for money somehow, Charlie? What's going on here?
You guys don't know, but Steve's got a Ferrari out front right now. I don't know what he's saying to you
Oh
guys. He's
boy, yeah,
just
can't wait to get back in it. And 30 minutes before this episode, I was helping a son cut down a limb that was about to fall from a huge tree. I have a very normal life.
uh,
Yesterday, last week's I was babysitting grandkids. We don't live charmed lives around here. We're just kind of serving and figuring out life as we go along, like the rest of you.
but I would say, um, to get kind of back to just rational thinking on this is even if you sold millions and millions of copies of it and you made millions and millions of dollars, that wouldn't render what you are saying in the book less true.
Well, what I've tried to do is to document everything I say so that you can go and look and see for yourself. When I say that a study found this, or this is somebody studied, 60 near death experiences and this was their conclusion, you can, yeah, whether I were making money or not off the book, you can go in and check out my data and see if you agree with it or not.
Yeah.
We think
Absolutely.
this is important stuff, and it's stuff that people are experiencing all around you, and we need answers for them. That's why
Yeah.
we're doing this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've seen the figures seemingly uptick in terms of how many near death. I mean, I've seen some say 1 in 25, but I've seen as high as 1 in 5 have a near death experience, those near dying. So and then when you take into account that hundreds of thousands of people are dying every day, that's over 10, potentially over 10,000 near death experiences are potentially happening every single day. And that's a lot of people out there who are having these experiences and are trying to make sense of it all. And, they're getting a range of reactions from some pastors telling them that they're visions of the devil, to then some people trying to raise them up on a pedestal and say, look, I would trust this experience more than I would trust anything else that I find in this life. And I think both of those positions are erroneous.
The current statistics on mortality are astounding. They're still at 100%. Every one of us is going to die. And what they found when they start talking to these people in nursing homes every day to see if they're having any experiences, over 80% of them, it's almost intrinsic to dying that they begin talking to deceased relatives, to angels, seeing wonderful scenes. Whatever you think of this, you need to think it through if you want to be able to minister to these people or interpret your own experiences when you have them.
Awesome. Okay, great. Well, I love today's episode, and I hope you guys did too. We will see you back here next week when we stream our very next awesome episode, and we'll be moving on into our next topics that we want to discuss. So, God bless. You guys have a great week, and we'll see you guys back here for the next.